Hello gentlemen, today we're going to talk about Emily Bronte and her poem Remembrance. Now Emily Bronte was one of a number of siblings, 6 of them exactly, and she was the 4th daughter. There was a brother and the rest were sisters, and she was born in 1818 in a little town called Thornton in Yorkshire. And when she was about 6 years old, her family moved to another little town called Haworth, where her father became the rector of the local church. Now Haworth was a very tiny little village, if you like, in the moors, a very bleak sort of place to grow up, very barren kind of a landscape, and this we'll see later had an effect on Emily's character. At one stage, one of her sisters died of tuberculosis, and she was then sent to boarding school in a town quite some distance away. But after about 3 months, she just couldn't handle it. She was very homesick, and so her father brought her home, and he and Emily's aunt actually homeschooled Emily from then on. She was quite a reclusive kind of a personality, and she enjoyed being in the outdoors on her own. And I think the sort of bleakness of her surroundings and the moorlands come through quite strongly in the poem, as well as in the one novel that she wrote called Wuthering Heights, which fortunately you don't have to study. Wuthering Heights is actually quite a bleak tale of doomed romance, etc., set in these dark, bleak moors. Nevertheless, at age 20, Emily moved off as a teacher. She moved to a town called Halifax, where she began teaching. But at that stage, the very long hours that she had to work, sometimes 17 hours a day, a little bit like St. Albans teachers actually, affected her health quite badly. And she went home then, stopped teaching, moved back with her father in Haworth. And her sisters wrote a number of poems and volumes of poetry. They wrote under aliases, because at that stage women weren't really accepted as authors, and so they wrote as men or under aliases with men's names. And this poem Remembrance of Emily Bronte is one of the poems from her collection. And really it's a poem about love and loss. It's centered on the death of a loved one, and whether this loved one is real or imaginary, we don't know, but we suspect that it's an imaginary loved one, since she died at the age of 30, and she talks in the poem about having missed this loved one for 15 years. So if that was the case, she'd have only been 15 years old when this loved one passed on. So probably it's an imaginary loved one. She and her sisters were known for making up quite fantastic and bizarre tales about adventure and fantasy, which they then sometimes even acted out in their environment at home. We're going to look at the poem now line for line, but you'll need a copy of the poem to follow as I go through it. Let's do a line-by-line analysis of the poem now. Remembrance by Emily Bronte. Cold in the earth, and the deep snow piled above thee, far, far removed, cold in the dreary grave. Have I forgot, my only love, to love thee, severed at last by time's all-severing wave? Right, so we know that the person that she's talking about is dead. Obviously they're buried. We know this from the words cold in the earth and deep snow piled above thee. So this particular time that she's writing the poem and that she's remembering this person is obviously winter. And the earth, including his grave, is covered by snow. In line 2, she says, far, far removed, cold in the dreary grave. Now that repetition of the word far just serves to emphasize the distance that she feels between this person that is dead and herself. Not physical distance, but just the fact that she feels far removed, as if this person is really now out of reach. And repetition often is just the way that a poet can emphasize things for us. Have I forgot, my only love, to love thee, severed at last by time's all-severing wave. Now that question might seem a bit odd. Have I forgot my only love to love thee? She's asking, has she forgotten to love him? But we know that she hasn't, because she's writing this poem about him. But it really just serves to emphasize the fact that her mind is continually on this person that she misses so much. Then in the last line there of the first stanza, severed at last by time's all-severing wave. Now we know that time is what exists only really when you're living, I guess. And so time's all-severing wave, all-severing, to cut off. Death is what cuts us off from real time as we know it. So this person is dead, cut off by time really. And time, you'll see there, is capitalized. So by doing that, the poet is personifying time, almost as if time is the reason, or that's time's fault, that perhaps that this person is dead. Line or stanza 2. Now, when alone, do my thoughts no longer hover over the mountains on that northern shore, resting their wings where heath and fern leaves cover thy noble heart for ever, evermore? So she's really asking, when I'm alone and I'm thinking, do my thoughts really, or are my thoughts really about you? Do I remember the place that you buried? And you'll notice the very geographical terms that she uses. She's very specific about mentioning the mountains, the northern shore, the heath and fern leaves, etc. And perhaps this is a reflection of the fact that Emily Bronte has grown up in a very wild kind of environment. She's not a people's person as much, and she enjoys spending time in nature. And so her references here are very geographical and will refer a lot to nature. Stanza 3. Cold in the earth, and 15 wild Decembers from those brown hills have melted into spring. Faithful, indeed, is the spirit that remembers after such years of change and suffering. Right, so she mentions that it's been 15 wild Decembers. So obviously there's a December in every year, so we know that it's 15 years that this person has been dead. The use of the word wild there is interesting. And that could be perhaps she's remembering the sort of wild and youthful games that they played together, perhaps. Or perhaps it's a reflection of the wild situation in which she finds herself on the moors and in this town that she's growing up in, which is really in a very desolate place. We know from the word melted into spring that the seasons have changed, that as winter turns into summer, the snow melts. And she mentions the word there, suffering, after such years of change and suffering. And perhaps that's a reflection of her own personal suffering, because we know that, as I mentioned in my introduction, she was a very sickly person, and in her family a number of her siblings died from tuberculosis, etc. And so perhaps she's mentioning that in terms of her own personal experience of life. In stanza 4 it says, sweet love of youth, forgive if I forget thee. While the world's tide is bearing me along, other desires and hopes beset me, hopes which obscure but cannot do thee wrong. So she's really almost apologizing or asking for forgiveness, if you like, of this person, this loved one that's died. And she's saying, if I do at times happen to forget thee, it's life. The world's tide is bearing me along as life carries me along. There are other things that I think about, other hopes that beset me, hopes which obscure, in other words, perhaps sidetrack me slightly, but they cannot do thee wrong. In other words, I don't forget about thee. It's never a case that I'm going to put you out of my mind, etc. But sometimes, perhaps just because of the course of life and the challenges that I face, perhaps my focus is not entirely on you the whole time. Stanza 5. No later light has lightened up my heaven. No second morn has ever shone for me. All my life's bliss from thy dear life was given. All my life's bliss is in the grave with thee. So she talks about a later light, or she says, no later light has lightened up my heaven. No second morn has ever shone for me. In other words, nothing else has brought me joy like you did. There's been no replacement, if you like, for what you've done in my life. And the alliteration there just serves to emphasize those words. In the second two lines there she says, all my life's bliss from thy dear life was given. All my life's bliss is in the grave with thee. Suggesting or saying directly that really her joy, bliss, came from this person only. And all of it came from him. And now that he's dead, basically her joy is in the grave with him. So really it was only that person, only he, that gave her the joy and meaning in her life. The next stanza, but when the days of golden dreams had perished, and even despair was powerless to destroy, then did I learn how existence could be cherished, strengthened, and fed without the aid of joy. Now that's quite interesting stuff there. When the days of golden dreams had perished, in other words, perhaps when the memories of good times had faded, and even despair was powerless to destroy, so perhaps even her despair, her pain and suffering couldn't destroy her pain, then did I learn how existence could be cherished, strengthened, and fed without the aid of joy. So really she's saying she's basically learned to cope. She's getting on with her life, but without the aid of joy. So she's getting by, but there's no joy in her life. Sad, really. Then did I check the tears of useless passion, weaned my young soul from yearning after thine, sternly denied its burning wish to hasten down to that tomb already more than mine. She talks about their tears of useless passion. Interesting. She's obviously, tears would be her mourning, her crying for this person. Why would those tears be useless? Well, perhaps because crying doesn't ease the pain, perhaps because crying doesn't bring the person back to life. So in a sense, the tears are really useless. She then says, weaned my young soul from yearning after thine. Now, weaned is normally a term that we use to talk about babies when they stop breastfeeding. So essentially, they're growing up. And so she's trying to wean her soul from yearning or longing after his. So really she's basically saying, look, I need to try and get over this. I need to stop relying on this memory of this person that I liked. And she's really having to make a conscious effort to keep herself from giving in to the grief. She says she had to sternly deny its burning wish to hasten down to that tomb already more than mine. She had to stop herself consciously from kind of just giving in and almost joining him in the grave. And then in the final stanza she says, and even yet I dare not let it languish, dare not indulge in memory's rapturous pain. Once drinking deep of that divinest anguish, how could I seek the empty world again? Now she makes use of a number of oxymorons here. She uses the term rapturous pain and divinest anguish, which seem to contradict each other. But if you think about it, the anguish that she feels about his death is sort of counterbalanced by the joy she gets in remembering him in a way. So those two terms, they're oxymoron, but if you inspect them closer, we see that it makes sense. In that first line she says, and even yet I dare not let it languish. So she dares not let her memory of him languish. And to languish means to become weak or feeble. So she wants to keep the memory of him alive. And she feels, as she says in the final line, how could I seek the empty world again? How after this can I actually even look for or participate in the empty world, the world being empty without his presence? So there's a lot in this poem, and you need the notes that I've given you to analyze it further and to look at some of the poetic devices in a bit more detail. Good luck.